This is the second part of our look at the life of St. Ignatius. In our first presentation, we focused primarily on the early stages of his experience. After his first 30 years of life, he then has this dramatic conversion experience on his recovery bed as he spent several months there reading about the life of Jesus and putting himself imaginatively into the story of Christ. And he also spends a significant amount of time reading a book called The Golden Legend, in which you have a summary of the lives of various saints. Certainly some of them, from a historical standpoint, are a little bit embellished, but many of them, of course, are built on a kernel of truth, and many of them do speak of profoundly heroic deeds that people have done in following Christ. And so St. Ignatius is drawn into those stories, into those very powerful and imaginative stories of Christ and the saints, and his allegiance gradually shifts from following the ways of the world to following the ways of Christ. And now, instead of devoting himself to earthly fame and fortune and pleasure, he now, his heart is redirected to want to find a way to serve Christ in a way that he is his king. And so his allegiance transfers from an earthly king to a heavenly king. So when he recovers from his wound in battle, he then journeys south toward the city of Barcelona, and there he intends to take a ship to the Holy Land, and there he wants to spend the rest of his life serving Christ, preaching in the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem, of course, being the holy city. That's the place, of course, the capital of God's people in the Old Testament, and then Jerusalem also is the place where Christ ascended prior to his death, burial, and resurrection. And so the city of Jerusalem had significant symbolic value for St. Ignatius, and so he journeys his way south. Along the way, he intends to stop at, actually there are several places that he stops, but the most significant of those stops would be to the mountain called Montserrat. Montserrat in Spanish means serrated mountain or jagged mountain. If you look at it from a distance, I had the pleasure of going there several years ago, and if you look at Montserrat from a distance, you see that it's very different than the other mountains around it. Drove across Spain, both north to south and as well as from east to west. And driving along in Spain, you see the typical sorts of mountains there, but then as you're driving from a distance toward Barcelona, you can see, or away from Barcelona too, you will see this mountain off in the distance. It's a very conspicuous place. And there were legends and stories about various mysterious things related to Catholic faith that transpired there. One of them was there were stories about this Black Madonna, this statue that was placed in a chapel on that mountain. Getting to the top of the mountain for St. Ignatius would have been a very treacherous journey, but for St. Ignatius he wanted to do challenging things. He wanted to do heroic things. So here he is. Remember, he has a leg that he never fully recovered from the limp and from the pain of the experience of having his leg essentially shattered. And so he hobbles along, or he walks along, he rides along on a donkey, trying to get his way to accomplish these heroic things that he wants to do. One thing that St. Ignatius is very clear about, and we should keep this in mind as we go through his story, one of the things that St. Ignatius is very clear about is that he knows that he is at a very immature stage of his spiritual development at this point. His desires are very, very strong, but they're mixed with other immaturities and other things about which he is ignorant in the spiritual life. And so he knows that in looking back. However, in the midst of his imperfections and his immaturity and his pride and so on, in the midst of all of that, he knows in retrospect, as he looks back on this experience later, that God is truly at work in his experience, that as he's journeying, as he's wanting to make these deep commitments, God is truly present there in the midst of all of this, in spite of all of the weaknesses of character and so on that he has, or perhaps mixed motives that he has for his actions. So here he is journeying south. I should tell you one quick story. Along the way, St. Ignatius mentions a case where a Moor, a Muslim, comes along next to St. Ignatius, and they get into a conversation, and the conversation centers on certain teachings about Mary, the mother of Jesus. Ignatius is frustrated by the conversation. Of course, he's not a theologian at this point. He doesn't understand all of the theology of Christ, of Mary, of God, and so on. He doesn't understand all of those things. But the Moor is clearly saying things that are insulting to his understanding, the Church's understanding of Mary. So the Moor, at a certain point, the road splits and he heads off into the town nearby. Ignatius continues to journey along on the road, and while he continues journeying, he thinks to himself, I probably should have spoken up more in defense of Mary. In fact, I probably should have even risen to her defense and killed this man. That shows you something about the state of his development here. He's so consumed with a chivalric idea, or with the notion that he is to defend the cause of Mary, the mother of Jesus, the mother of the King. I so should have defended her that perhaps I should have killed the Moor. And so he struggles or battles within himself. What should I do about this? Should I go back into the city and find him and take his life, or confront him about this? And so he gets to a little bit further down the road. There's a split in the road again, and the split in one direction would take him back into the city that the Moor went into. And so he decides to let the donkey decide what direction they will go. He does not influence the donkey in one way or another, and says, if the donkey continues to go forward toward Barcelona, then I will not go back into the city and take the life of the Moor. If the donkey, on the other hand, goes off toward the city, then I will consider that a sign that I should go and take his life. Again, it shows you something about the stage of his moral development and of his understanding of Christian things. But it also shows you something about his passion and his desire to take what he had wanted to live for and to transfer that over into the cause of Christ, or the serving Christ as King. So anyway, he continues his journey down south toward Barcelona, and along the way he stops in the city of the mountain of Montserrat, and there he ascends to the top of the mountain, and there he lays down his sword, taking to himself the cloak of a beggar. This is a symbolic act. He kneels before the statue of the Black Madonna. He lays down his sword, and he makes a vow, alleging himself to a life of serving Christ as his King. And there, as evidence of that, he stands guard all night long in front of the statue, as a way of saying, I'm showing the depth of my commitment, the quality of my commitment. He journeys back down from the mountain. This is another very significant symbolic act in the life of St. Ignatius. We've seen two of them. The first one, of course, his experiences on his recovery bed, and now secondly, his experience on Montserrat, where he goes and makes this symbolic act or gesture in which he makes this vow of his life, his commitment of his life to following Christ as his King. He then decides to go for a short time, at least his initial plan is to go for a short time and stay at a hospital, perhaps because of fatigue or some other illness. He decides to go to a small town north of Montserrat called Manresa. Manresa in the time of Ignatius would have been a small town. It continues to be a relatively small town if you go there today. I had the pleasure of going there as well, and going to some of the sites that I'll mention to you in just a moment. But it certainly is not a spectacular town. It was a relatively small one, but St. Ignatius went there perhaps to rest for a few days before he finished his journey to Barcelona, which is not very far away from Manresa. So I would suspect that Manresa would be, 7, 8, 9 miles north of Montserrat. So he goes to Manresa, and there he ends up staying, actually for the better part of a year. His original intention is not to stay there that long, but he ends up staying there the better part of a year. And he tells us in his autobiography some of the most significant experiences of his life are going to take place there at Manresa. It's going to be a year, or almost a year, of deep learning for St. Ignatius. There he will find, in the city, on the outskirts of the city, near the river, there's a river that runs there by the city called the Cardinere River. And the Cardinere River, near the banks of the Cardinere River, was a cave. And Ignatius would go to that cave on a regular basis, and there he would pray for significant periods of time. While he was praying, he developed an approach to the spiritual life based on using imagination, based on taking certain themes in the life of Christ and entering deeply into those over a period of 30 days. How far he advanced that during his time at Manresa, we don't know for sure. What we do know is that the essence of what we came to call later, or what came to be known as the spiritual exercises, a central part of the spirituality of St. Ignatius and his followers, the Jesuits, the central elements of that were developed there in Manresa. Also, Ignatius tells us, while there at Manresa, he has a series of experiences. And he speaks about those experiences, not in great detail. In fact, he refuses to talk about them in great detail, But he has a series of experiences while he's there at the Cardinal River and there in the city of Manresa that he calls illuminations. They were moments when his mind is enlightened and he comes to see some truth, or he comes to understand something more fully. In fact, he says that he had experiences there that all of the rest of his life, all of the learning that he would accumulate the rest of his life, pales in comparison to what he saw and what he learned there in the city of Manresa. So in Manresa there was a tremendous amount of learning, a tremendous amount of spiritual insight that St. Ignatius gained. I would only mention to you maybe one or two examples of the illuminations or insights that Ignatius got. Ignatius, for instance, on one occasion pictures or sees, or hears, I guess I should say, an illustration or an analogy for the mystery of the Trinity. He's trying to understand, what does it mean to say that God is one, but yet God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? And somehow he hears, or he comes to think of, the illustration of several keys on a musical instrument being played together at the same time and blending together harmoniously. So you can listen to the sounds as they blend together and think of them as truly one, but yet they can be differentiated or distinguished between. And Ignatius is captivated by this insight that God is both one and three. You can distinguish between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but you cannot separate them because they blend together harmoniously into the full essence of the one God, of the three persons who are the one God. In any case, Ignatius simply tells us about this experience that he has of the mystery of the Trinity in terms of a sound. And then in another of his illuminations that he has, he sees a bright light, and from that light various rays that are issuing forth from it. The meaning of the illustration seems to be this, that Ignatius, in this burst of insight, sees that everything, every truth, emanates forth from or issues forth from God. God is the supreme truth, and every ray that comes from God is created by God. It finds its origin in God. And in that sense, every light in this world, every created light, every truth that we discover in this world, if we look at it properly, should and can direct us back to its cause. This is going to be very important, I think, for the history of the Jesuits, because the Jesuits, the society of the religious order that comes out of the life of St. Ignatius, this religious order of the Jesuits is characterized by its interest in entering into many different areas of life, various different ministries. For the Jesuits, you can serve God as a scientist, you can serve God as a theologian, you can serve God as a philosopher, you can serve God as a doctor, a medical doctor, you can serve God in many different ways, because every avenue of life, every area of research and study and investigation, every area of activity can direct you back to God if you look at it in the right way. And so the Jesuits, and coming from Ignatius's own experience, are very interested in drawing people into the experience of God, drawing people into an awareness of God through many different paths or many different avenues of knowledge and insight. So the experiences there at Manresa, and there are more, of course. Ignatius deeply struggles there with depression. He contemplates even suicide. He struggles very much with what we call scrupulosity. That scrupulosity is an over-preoccupation with one's foibles, one's faults, one's imperfections. In this sense, Ignatius strikes me as somewhat similar to the experience of Martin Luther, who also struggled very deeply with those types of things, struggles with a sense of his own imperfection. Ignatius is eventually able to overcome this and theologically to see his way out of this over-preoccupation with his imperfections. But his experiences at Manresa, that year practically that he spends there, is an incredibly important transformative and developmental stage in Ignatius's experience. There's much more to be said about Ignatius's life, but certainly nothing more that we can say that's more important than the fundamental foundational experiences that we've described so far. In the history of Christianity, there are a lot of people who have experienced dramatic conversion experiences at some point in their life. Not everybody does, but there are a good number of cases of people who experience dramatic conversion to following Christ and the way of Christ after having lived perhaps a life of debauchery or a life of selfishness, and then they turn fundamentally to following Christ, sometimes from one religious way of thinking to another, like in the case of the Apostle Paul, or in the case of St. Augustine, for example, from a life of confusion and a life of maybe womanizing and so on, to a life of following Christ in a very radical way. Much more to be said, but that gets us started and looks at some of the major aspects of St. Ignatius's experience.